I've been camping in the woods more times than I can count. From the tall, thick forests of the Appalachians to the quiet, remote stretches of Northern California, there's something calming about being out there. The crisp air, the sound of wind rustling through trees, the freedom of no phone calls or distractions. But sometimes, things don't go as planned. This story, though, is one of the ones that sticks with me. One that'll always be in my mind no matter how much time passes. I've never quite shaken it, and I don't think I ever will. It all started one summer afternoon when I decided to go on a solo hike in a state park. It wasn't a massive park, but it was dense with trees, hilly in spots, and had a mix of trails that were well-marked and others that were more rugged. Perfect for someone who wanted to be alone but not too far off the beaten path. I packed my bag, water, food, my journal, a map, and set out mid-morning. The air was already warm, the sun peeking through the branches above. I figured I'd be out there for a few hours, maybe half the day at most. The trail I chose was a loop that wound through the heart of the forest. It started off fairly easy, just a narrow dirt path surrounded by thick bushes and trees. Birds were singing overhead, and I passed a few other hikers, exchanging brief nods as we went our separate ways. Felt good to be out there. The smell of pine and damp earth was familiar, soothing even. About an hour in, I stopped at a small creek to refill my water bottle. The sound of the water flowing over the rocks was calming, and I sat down for a moment, taking a break. That's when I noticed something odd. A shape moving between the trees, just beyond the creek. It wasn't far, but it was enough to catch my eye. A flash of something dark, shifting, almost like a person. I couldn't be sure from where I was, and I thought maybe I was just tired or imagining it. I shook it off and took a drink from my bottle before continuing on. But the feeling lingered. I started moving again, walking along the trail, but now I was more aware of the silence around me. The birds had stopped singing, and the usual forest noise seemed to have quieted down. It wasn't strange enough to make me panic, but it was odd. I shrugged it off as the wind, or maybe a shift in the weather. Still, something wasn't quite right. The path began to narrow, turning into more of a dirt and rock scramble. I had to pay closer attention to where I was stepping, especially as the incline began to rise. I lost track of time, focusing on the climb, but after another half hour or so, I reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below. I paused, wiping the sweat from my forehead, and took in the view. It was peaceful, too peaceful. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like a twig snapping, came from the woods to my right. I froze, listening. There it was again. Another snap, then the soft rustling of leaves. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be just an animal. I stood still, heart beating a little faster now, straining to hear any other sound. It was coming from the trees just off the trail, but it didn't sound like a normal forest noise. It was something else, something human. I wasn't scared yet, but I was cautious. There are always people in the woods. Sometimes they're just lost or wander off the trail, but in a place this remote, it felt different. I glanced around, trying to spot the source, but the dense woods didn't give me much of a view. The sounds stopped. I took a few cautious steps forward, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up now. The trail continued up the ridge, so I decided to push on. I had made it this far, and I didn't want to turn back yet. The sounds from the woods behind me had stopped, but the unsettling feeling stayed with me. I could hear my own breathing as I moved forward, each step seeming louder than the last. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed in the breeze, but the forest around me still felt too quiet. Eventually, I made it to the top of the ridge. The view was incredible. An endless stretch of trees, the valley below, and the sky, now turning a soft blue as afternoon edged closer. I stood there for a while, just taking it in. The peacefulness of it all was calming. I didn't hear any more sounds from behind me, and I started to relax. That's when I noticed something. To my left, down the ridge, there was a small clearing. It was almost hidden, tucked between the trees, but I could make out the shape of a large rock in the center. Something about it caught my eye, and I started to walk toward it, curiosity tugging at me. As I got closer, I saw something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, leading to the clearing. They weren't human, though, not the kind I expected to see. They were large, maybe the size of a man's, but the pattern was all wrong. They weren't animal tracks either. I knelt down, examining them, but I couldn't make sense of them. My heart started to pound in my chest again as I looked around, realizing how isolated I was. No one else was near, and the sound of the wind in the trees was the only thing I could hear. It felt wrong, like I was being watched. I stood up quickly and took a step back, feeling a cold sweat on my forehead. I wasn't sure what had made those tracks, but I had no intention of finding out. I turned around, heading back toward the main trail, telling myself it was just an odd occurrence. But as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. At first, it was a faint sensation, a shift in the air that made my skin prickle. But then, as I picked up my pace, I heard something behind me. Footsteps, faint but distinct. They were keeping pace with me, just close enough to make me uneasy. My breath quickened as I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. The forest was still too still, but I could feel it now, a presence. I didn't look back again. I kept moving, faster now, my legs pushing me harder as I tried to outrun whatever was back there. The trail started to descend, and I knew I was getting closer to the bottom. But the footsteps were still there, just out of sight. The rhythm was the same, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was toying with me, staying just out of reach. Panic started to claw at my chest. I had to get out of the woods. I hit the main trail again, but now I wasn't alone. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming. I looked around, trying to spot anything that could explain it, but the woods were as quiet as ever. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the shadows of the trees stretched longer, but I couldn't shake the sense of danger closing in. I sped up, not caring if I was running out of breath. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with thoughts of what might be out there. What was following me? I wasn't going to stick around to find out. As I neared the end of the trail, I saw a familiar signpost, just 100 yards or so from the parking lot. The woods were finally beginning to thin out, and I could see the open space ahead. My pace quickened even more. The footsteps, or whatever they were still behind me. I could hear them, closer now, almost in sync with my own steps. But just as I reached the edge of the woods, I saw something ahead. A figure. A person, standing by the trail, looking down at me. I nearly stumbled as I stopped short, catching my breath. The figure didn't move, just stood there, facing me. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a person in the dimming light. I didn't wait. I ran the last few yards to the parking lot, reaching my car, heart racing. I turned around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. The figure was gone. The footsteps stopped. I sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm down, but my hands were shaking. I don't know what was out there that day or who or what. I thought I was being followed by. But when I finally drove away, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It stayed with me the whole way home, and I still feel it sometimes, especially when I think about that forest. I haven't gone back to that trail. Maybe one day I'll return to the woods, but not there. Not ever. Something in those trees made me feel like I was being hunted, and I won't ignore that feeling again. I know better now. The woods have their secrets, and some of them are best left untouched. Family used to own a cabin on a lake deep in the Northwoods. It wasn't one of those lakes you'd find on a tourist map. There was no public access, just a quiet, isolated place tucked into the woods. On the far side of the lake, there was an old girls' camp that the state was letting fall apart. The camp had been around for decades. It had a large two-story main house and a handful of smaller cabins. By the time my sister and her husband went to check it out, the house was mostly intact, but the years of neglect were starting to show. The windows were dirty, the paint was peeling off the wood, and the whole place had a weathered, decaying feel to it. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back now, I wonder if we all should have stayed far away from that place. It started with my sister and her husband deciding to take the canoe over to the old camp one afternoon. They were always the adventurous ones, wanting to explore places no one else dared go. I think it was a combination of curiosity and boredom, and they were eager to see the camp up close. The canoe ride across the lake took them maybe 20 minutes, but the entire time, my sister told me later, it felt strange. Like the lake was too still, too quiet. The trees on the other side of the lake formed this thick wall, and there was this thick, green fog that seemed to cling to the water's surface. When they reached the shore, they made their way to the camp. At first, it felt like just another old abandoned place. Dilapidated, overgrown with vines, and forgotten by time. They wandered around the main house for a while, poking their heads into the various rooms, some with rotting wooden floors and others with broken windows. My sister said it was clear that this place hadn't been touched in years, like no one had been there in forever. There was a musty smell, the scent of wet wood and decaying things, mixed with a faint trace of something else, something my sister couldn't quite place but which sent an odd shiver down her spine. They eventually made their way upstairs. The creaking of the old wooden stairs echoed in the empty house. The upstairs rooms were even worse. You could see the sagging floorboards and water stains on the walls where leaks had let in rain for years. The place seemed like it could collapse at any moment, but it had this strange, quiet energy that made them feel like they should keep moving. They passed through the rooms, looking at the remnants of the camp's old days. Tattered curtains, broken furniture, and old photographs scattered about. The further they explored, the more uncomfortable they began to feel. My sister said the air felt heavier, as if the house was trying to hold onto the past. That's when they first heard it, the sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, they thought it was their own footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. But then the steps became louder, more distinct and heavier, like someone was walking around in boots, stomping around upstairs. They froze. The hair on the back of my sister's neck stood up. They listened closely, but the sound didn't stop. It was too clear to ignore. Someone was upstairs with them. The footsteps grew louder, and then, just as my sister turned to her husband with wide, frightened eyes, the sound changed. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was a heavy pounding, like someone running toward the stairs. Panic hit them both at once. Without saying a word, they both turned and bolted for the stairs, rushing down, nearly tripping over each other in their haste. They didn't stop to look back. All they knew was that there was someone else in the house, and they needed to get out. Fast. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs and ran through the main floor, the sound of footsteps came thundering after them, getting louder and louder until it felt like the person chasing them was right behind them. They didn't go straight for the door. Instead, they ran around the outside of the house, hoping to get some distance from whoever or whatever was inside. The old house creaked and groaned around them, almost like it was alive. They heard the footsteps follow them, still heavy and quick, but they couldn't see anyone. No one was there, but the sound was unmistakable. It was right behind them, following them in perfect time. By the time they made it around the house, they were gasping for breath, their hearts pounding. They didn't stop to catch their breath, though. They didn't even think about what was behind them, they just kept moving. At some point, they heard the door to the house slam open behind them. It was a loud, jarring sound that echoed through the woods. My sister's eyes widened, and she grabbed her husband's arm. They could hear the steps again, this time coming from inside the house and out into the yard. The person or thing was outside now. They didn't know what to do. They had no weapons, no way to defend themselves, and they weren't about to hang around to find out who or what was after them. So they did the only thing they could think of. They ran into the woods. The trees were dense, and the ground was uneven, but they kept running, pushing through the underbrush, not daring to look back. They could hear the footsteps again, crashing through the leaves behind them. Whoever was chasing them was fast, too fast. My sister said she could feel the person or thing gaining on them. She could hear branches snapping underfoot, just behind them, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as if someone was right there, breathing down her neck. They didn't stop running. They didn't even know where they were headed anymore, only that they needed to get away. They ran through the trees, their feet stumbling over roots and rocks, until they finally reached the edge of the forest and could see the lake again. But even then, they didn't stop. They kept moving around the shoreline, hoping to get back to the canoe. By the time they reached the canoe, they were both out of breath, drenched in sweat, and their nerves were frayed. But when they looked back at the camp, everything seemed still. There was no sign of anyone following them, no movement from the house. It was like whoever or whatever had been chasing them had just disappeared. But the sound of the footsteps still rang in their ears. My sister said that they didn't even think to look around before they jumped into the canoe and paddled furiously back across the lake. They didn't care about the noise, the choppy water, or the boat's unsteady rhythm. They just needed to get away. They made it back to the cabin without incident, but neither of them could shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that had been in that house, following them, waiting. They never went back to the camp. Not once. My dad and I went back later that day to pick up the canoe, but nothing happened. It was quiet, as if nothing had ever happened at all. The camp was still standing there, just as it had been before. My dad shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a squatter or someone looking to hide out in the woods. But I couldn't help but feel uneasy. There was something wrong about that place. Something about the way the air felt when you got close to the camp. My sister and her husband didn't go back, and neither did anyone else from the family. We all just agreed to stay away. Over the years, I've often wondered about that camp. What had they heard up there? Was it really just someone hiding out in the house? Or was it something else? Something that made that house feel like it was alive? Something that could move with you through the woods, stalking you from the shadows? The whole thing still sits with me, unsettling, unanswered. I don't know if we'll ever truly know what was out there. But one thing's for sure. That place was more than just an old, abandoned camp. There was something wrong with it, and I'll never forget the way it made my sister and her husband feel, the way they never wanted to talk about it again. They don't like to bring it up, but sometimes when we all sit around the cabin at night, I can't help but ask if they've ever wondered what was in that house. They just look at each other, silent, like they're reliving it all over again. And then, after a long moment, they'll shake their heads and say, "We're not going back." It was around 2 a.m. on that hot summer night when I woke up, needing to relieve myself. The air was thick with humidity, and the rustling of the leaves in the trees outside our tent was the only sound breaking the stillness. My friends were all asleep, and I had trouble shaking off the grogginess that clung to me. I wasn't particularly scared. I had camped before, out in the woods near where I lived, but this trip was different. We were somewhere deep in central Texas, a place I wasn't too familiar with. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about this night made the woods feel heavier. I squinted at the tent entrance, the dark fabric against the starry sky. I was alone, the only one awake. I didn't want to wake anyone, so I decided to slip out quietly. I could see the outline of the campfire pit from where I stood, still faintly glowing with embers. I pulled the zipper of the tent open just enough for me to slide through, careful not to make a sound. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, a welcome change from the warmth inside the tent. I stepped softly, trying not to disturb the ground beneath me. The forest was calm, too calm. The smell of pine and damp earth mixed with the lingering scent of the fire, and for a second, I felt comforted by the usual smells of camping. My eyes hadn't quite adjusted to the darkness yet, but I didn't need much light to find a tree. I had camped in the woods enough to know that it didn't take much to find a place to go. There was a large oak about 20 feet away from the tent, standing tall in the shadows. I walked towards it, doing my best not to step on any twigs or branches that might give away my position. As soon as I was far enough from the tent, I began to pee, feeling the coolness of the night air on my skin. My bladder emptied, and I let out a relieved sigh, feeling the tension leave my body. But then it happened, a crunching sound. A leaf or twig snapped, but it wasn't the kind of noise you expect in the woods at night. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't succeeding. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze midstream. My bladder told me to finish, but my mind was screaming for me to stop. I squinted into the darkness, trying to adjust my eyes. It was hard to see anything beyond the faint shadows, but as my eyes began to adjust, I saw it. Two glowing yellow eyes. They were fixed on me, unmoving, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick again, and my pulse began to hammer in my ears. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Those eyes, bright in the darkness, were watching me with an intensity that made every muscle in my body lock up. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The only thing I could do was stand there, paralyzed by those eyes. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. I finished as quickly as I could, but I felt like I was moving in slow motion, each movement exaggerated and painfully loud. My pants felt heavy as I pulled them back up, and I forced myself to keep my gaze on the eyes, terrified that if I looked away, something would happen. I took a small, careful step back, trying to keep my breathing steady. I didn't want to make a sound, but as soon as I moved, I heard a hiss. It wasn't a growl or a bark or anything I could have predicted. It was a sound that sent a shiver through my spine, a sharp hiss that echoed in the stillness of the night. My heart raced in my chest. The creature in front of me made no move towards me, but that hiss, it was like a warning, like it was telling me, "Don't come closer." I froze again. My mind was screaming for me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The creature's eyes didn't leave mine, and I felt like I was caught in some kind of trance. I could hear my own breath now, shallow and fast, but there was no other sound. The forest was silent, too silent. It was then that I noticed something else. The creature was large, much larger than any cat I had ever seen. Its eyes, glowing yellow like lanterns in the night, were unsettlingly still. The shape of its body was almost too big for a typical animal in the area. It was like a giant shadow in the woods. But it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a wolf. It was something else, something that didn't belong. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my mind racing through every animal I had learned about in biology class, but nothing seemed to fit. I had heard of mountain lions before, of course, but this was different. I couldn't tell if it was a mountain lion or something else entirely. Its size and stance seemed off, too tall, too broad in the shoulders. It looked like it was standing on all fours, but its body wasn't the sleek, muscular frame of a predator. It was bulky, heavy in a way that didn't make sense. Then, it did something that made the blood drain from my face. Turned, slowly, not out of fear, but as if it had lost interest. It didn't seem threatened or scared. It simply moved away from me, like I wasn't even worth the trouble. I didn't know if I should move or stay frozen in place. My brain was in overdrive, trying to understand what I had just seen. The creature moved with an unsettling grace, its steps silent on the forest floor, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves beneath its paws. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body still frozen, but my mind racing. I watched as the creature disappeared into the trees, its yellow eyes still visible for a moment, before they too faded into the darkness. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, but my body was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even dare to move until I couldn't see it anymore. Then, with trembling legs, I backed up, slowly, making my way back to the tent. I didn't run, but I wanted to. I wanted to turn and sprint away from that thing as fast as I could. But something in me told me to stay calm, to keep my distance. When I finally got back to the tent, I didn't say anything to my friends. I just crawled in, my heart still racing, and pulled the sleeping bag up over my head. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing those glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and when morning finally came, I was too exhausted to talk about what had happened. Felt like a nightmare, but I knew it hadn't been. We packed up camp in silence, and I don't think anyone noticed how quiet I had become. I never mentioned what I saw to anyone. Couldn't. I didn't want to seem crazy, and besides, what could I possibly say? I wasn't sure what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't anything normal. It wasn't any animal I had ever heard of or seen. To this day, I don't know what it was. I've thought about it a lot over the years, but the only conclusion I can come to is that it was some kind of predator, maybe a mountain lion or something else. But whatever it was far too close and far too calm in its presence. I still think about that night sometimes, and I'll never forget those glowing eyes. We were in British Columbia, just passing through on a road trip with a group of friends. We'd been traveling for days, hopping from one town to the next, enjoying the freedom of the open road. Everything was going smoothly until our bus broke down in a small town. It wasn't anything serious, just a mechanical issue, but it was enough to leave us stranded for a day or two while the mechanic worked on it. The bus was old, and we were far away from any kind of city or busy area. The mechanic gave us the bad news with a shrug, but at least he was a friendly guy. He told us that there was a small wooded area just behind his shop where we could camp for the night while we waited for the repairs. Seemed like a good idea. The mechanic warned us about bears, saying we should be careful, but other than that, it seemed pretty peaceful. He gave us a quick nod as if it was a routine thing. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a casual warning. He also mentioned a river that ran down from the mountains. The water was supposed to be cold but clear, perfect for drinking or washing up. We packed up our bags and walked toward the woods. The sun was still high in the sky, but the trees quickly began to cast long, stretching shadows as we got deeper into the forest. The air smelled fresh, like wet earth and pine needles, and the sound of the river flowing nearby gave everything a calm, tranquil feeling. We were a group of 6, all in our mid-20s, with no particular worries except for the bus that had broken down. We didn't have much in terms of gear, just some basic camping supplies and tents. We weren't exactly wilderness experts, but we knew enough to get by for a night or two. It was supposed to be a simple, no-fuss camping trip, just a way to kill time while we waited for the bus to be fixed. We kept walking, looking for a flat area to set up camp. The trees were thick, and the undergrowth was dense, but we found a spot by the river that seemed perfect. It was just off the main trail, with enough space for our tents, and we could hear the sound of the water running nearby. The setting seemed ideal until we kept walking and came across the first abandoned campsite. It wasn't what you'd expect from an abandoned site. There were no old tents or signs of life that had simply been forgotten. The campsite looked like it had been destroyed, violently so. One of the tents was shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters from the remnants of its poles. The sleeping bags inside were ripped open, and everything looked tossed around in chaos. It was strange. There was no garbage or signs of wild animals, just the raw destruction. I don't know why, but the sight sent a shiver down my spine. We walked past it quickly, a bit uneasy, but didn't say much. Maybe it was just the weather or some kind of accident. People sometimes leave campsites behind when they move on, but it still felt off. There was a strange silence around the area, like everything was holding its breath. We kept walking, and not far from the first site, we came across another one. This one wasn't as badly destroyed, but it was clear that whoever had stayed there had left in a hurry. The campfire was still partially smoldering, and the tent had a gaping hole in its side, as though something large had torn through it. The ground around the site was disturbed, footprints and broken branches scattered about. It wasn't the kind of mess you'd expect from a normal campsite, but we didn't talk much about it. Then, I saw something lying on the ground in the middle of the site. It was a small ceramic clown doll, the kind you'd wind up and it would play a lullaby. The doll was chipped, its paint faded and peeling, but it still had a strange, unsettling presence. I knelt down to pick it up, curiosity getting the better of me, and when I wound it up, it started playing a soft, eerie lullaby. The sound echoed through the forest, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us had frozen. The melody was old, and it sounded out of place in the forest. It didn't belong there. I quickly stopped the wind-up and tucked the doll in my bag, feeling suddenly very uneasy. My friends didn't seem to notice the tension in the air, and we continued on our way to find a spot to camp. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was as if the air around us had grown heavier, denser, and the trees seemed to loom a little closer. The sound of the river was no longer calming. It was just another noise, distant and impersonal. We finally found a relatively clear spot near the water and set up our tents. As we were unpacking and getting everything ready, I couldn't help but keep glancing over my shoulder. The forest behind us felt like it was watching us, and the wind through the trees seemed to carry whispers, though I knew it was just the sound of the branches moving. That night, as the sky darkened, we built a fire and sat around it, laughing and talking about our travels. But despite the warmth of the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were too quiet, almost unnervingly so. Every now and then, the sound of a branch snapping or a rustle in the bushes would make me jump, but every time I looked around, there was nothing there. The others were enjoying themselves, but I could sense that they, too, were uneasy. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the remnants of those destroyed campsites, but none of us felt at ease. We sat around the fire late into the night, telling stories and playing card games, trying to distract ourselves from the growing tension in the woods. But the air felt thicker as the night wore on, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. At one point, I got up to relieve myself and walked a little ways into the trees. The moon was full, casting pale light through the branches, and everything around me seemed to hold its breath. The river gurgled softly in the distance, but there was no other sound. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was like the forest had gone dead silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finished quickly and turned back toward camp, but something made me stop. I heard a faint rustling sound behind me, deeper in the woods. I stood still, straining my ears, but the noise had stopped. Maybe it was a bear, or maybe just the wind. I didn't want to scare myself over nothing, but I couldn't help it. The whole place felt wrong. When I returned to the campfire, everyone was still talking, but the mood had shifted. No one mentioned it, but there was an unspoken understanding that the night wasn't as peaceful as we had hoped. We sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound. I kept the clown doll tucked in my bag, though every time I glanced at it, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Eventually, we went to bed one by one. My tent was far from the fire, and as I lay inside, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the branches creaking above me. The sounds of the forest were no longer peaceful. They were unsettling, like the trees were groaning in discomfort. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I lay there, staring at the canvas ceiling of my tent, and tried to ignore the fear creeping up my spine. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just lay there, wide-eyed, listening to the forest around me. The sounds grew louder, more pronounced. The snapping of branches, the rustling of leaves, and every now and then, the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else entirely. Morning finally came, and the sky was gray with overcast clouds. The others were still asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong with that night. I got up quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and went to the river to wash up. The cold water felt good on my face, and the sound of the river was the only thing that calmed my nerves. When I returned to camp, I noticed that everything seemed just a little more peaceful. The air was clearer, the forest less oppressive. I didn't say anything about the feeling I had during the night, but I could tell that the others had noticed something too. It wasn't until later, when we packed up and prepared to leave, that we finally spoke about the previous night. As we were leaving, I couldn't resist looking back at the abandoned campsites one last time. The first one, the completely destroyed site, still looked the same, empty and broken. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened here, something we couldn't understand. Maybe it was the bears the mechanic warned us about, or maybe it was just the quiet isolation of the forest. Whatever it was, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. The wind-up clown doll, I left it behind, sitting on a log near the river, its eerie lullaby still ringing faintly in the air. We made it back to the mechanic's shop and waited for the bus to be repaired. It wasn't until we got on the road again, the familiar hum of the engine beneath us, that I could finally breathe a little easier. I didn't talk much on the drive out of town, but I think everyone in the group felt the same unease about the woods. Whatever had happened there, we couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing for sure: I didn't want to find out. It was October, years ago now, but I still remember it like it happened last week. I was 22, still figuring life out. I'd been set up on a date with a girl named Emily through mutual friends. We were both nervous, the kind of nervous you get when you're not sure if the other person even wants to be there. But as the night went on, we warmed up to each other. Nothing fancy, just burgers and milkshakes at a little diner in Salt Lake. It was close to Halloween, and the whole town had that chilly edge to it, like the world was leaning just a little further into the dark. You could feel it in the wind, how it would cut through your clothes and make your bones shiver. It was the kind of cold that made you want to be around other people just to keep something human close by. After dinner, neither of us really wanted the night to end. The food was fine, the conversation had started to flow easier, and there was that spark, that awkward, new kind of excitement. I didn't want to take her home just yet. We were both kind of outdoorsy, and I suggested we go for a late-night walk. Something different, something quiet. I knew Provo Canyon pretty well. I'd done a lot of rock climbing out there during high school and some in college. I remembered this one trail, not a long one, maybe 20 or 30 minutes each way, but it was beautiful at night, especially when the moon was out. You could see the stars clearer up there too. Less light pollution, and the canyon walls had this way of blocking out the rest of the world. She agreed. No hesitation, which surprised me a little. I figured maybe she was just being polite, or maybe she really was the kind of person who liked adventure, even if it came in small doses. So we drove our cars out toward the mouth of the canyon. It was a new moon that night, which I hadn't really thought about until we parked. No moonlight meant pitch black in the woods, especially once we got under the tree cover. I had a little flashlight in my glove box, but I didn't want to come off like I was planning the whole thing. It was supposed to be spontaneous, so we left it behind. We started walking, our shoes crunching against loose gravel and dirt. The first part of the trail is open. No trees for a few hundred yards, just scrubby brush and rock, with the hills rolling up on either side like giant sleeping animals. The air was crisp and smelled like cold stone and distant pine. The only light we had came from the stars, which were clear and scattered across the sky like someone had tossed glitter on black velvet. The quiet was thick, just our footsteps and the occasional rustle of wind through dry grass. We didn't talk much at first, just walked side by side, hands close but not touching. I remember glancing over at her now and then, trying to read her expression in the starlight. It was hard to see her clearly, but she seemed calm, thoughtful maybe, or just soaking it in. Either way, it felt peaceful, even a little magical. We'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when I felt it. Just a little twinge, a twist in my gut. I ignored it, the kind of thing that happens sometimes when you're in unfamiliar territory, even when you've been there before. But I had this feeling, like the trees ahead were too quiet, like they were holding their breath. I pushed it down. I didn't want to be the guy who gets spooked in front of his date, so I kept walking. The trail curved gently and began sloping up into denser tree cover. The stars started disappearing above us, eaten by the dark branches. Felt like stepping into a tunnel. I felt her footsteps slow a little behind me, like she felt it too, but neither of us said anything. We just kept moving. The ground under the trees was darker. The air was colder there too. I could see the trail only in vague outlines, like lighter smudges on dark earth. We walked slower. I had to watch my footing more. The path narrowed, pinched by the thick roots and undergrowth on both sides. The silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to stop. I could hear my own breathing now, loud in my ears. And again, that feeling returned, stronger. Not fear exactly, not yet, but something like a warning bell ringing far away. I stopped walking. She stopped too, maybe just a step behind me. I looked ahead. I couldn't see much of anything, just shadows. But I didn't want to turn back yet. I told myself it was just the dark, the quiet, maybe some nerves. This was fine. We were fine. I took a step forward, and that's when I felt it. My right foot hit something soft, something that wasn't dirt or leaves or trail. My foot bounced slightly, like I had stepped on a rolled-up jacket. But when I shifted my weight, it didn't feel like cloth. It gave a little, then held. It was the wrong shape, too solid to be a blanket or sleeping bag, too soft to be a rock or log. I froze. My body told me to move, but I couldn't. My heart started pounding, fast and deep like a drum in my chest. The air around me felt wrong, heavy like the trees were leaning in. My skin crawled. My stomach turned cold. I didn't bend down. I didn't try to find out what it was. I just stepped back, carefully, slowly. My foot slipped on some leaves, and I caught myself. I reached out, found her hand, and we turned around. Neither of us spoke. We just started walking, fast, not running, not yet, but our footsteps were louder now, quicker. The quiet behind us felt thicker, followed us. I didn't look back, couldn't. The trail opened up again after a few minutes, and we started to move faster. My heart was still pounding. I could hear her breathing next to me, short, clipped. We didn't stop until we were at our cars. We got in without saying anything, just wide eyes and pale faces. I remember sitting there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, staring into the dark trees ahead, wondering what I had stepped on. We never talked about it. We dated for a while after that, ended up getting married. But that night stayed tucked away, like some things are better left alone, better left in the dark. It was probably 8 years later. We were living in a small house outside Salt Lake. 2 kids by then. Life had settled into a routine. One night, I was flipping through channels while she was folding laundry. Some true crime special came on. One of those old interview-style shows with grainy footage and dim lighting. They were talking about Ted Bundy. We both froze when they mentioned Utah. Bundy had spent time in Utah in the mid-70s. That wasn't news to us. Everyone in the state knew that. But then the interviewer asked him about close calls, about the times he almost got caught. He started talking about Provo Canyon. He said he had lured a girl out there one night, killed her. He didn't say her name. Said he had just finished when he heard voices, footsteps coming up the trail. He said he barely had time to hide in the trees. Said he watched as a couple came walking up the path. Said the guy stepped right onto the body. I stopped breathing. I couldn't move. He said he watched us, watched me stop, watched me hesitate. He said he thought he'd have to kill us too, but we just turned around, walked away. He laughed a little when he said that. Not a big laugh, just a soft one, like he still didn't understand why we didn't find the body, why I didn't bend down to check. He said he was ready to do it, ready to kill again, but we left. We were too fast, too lucky. The show moved on, talked about other things, other victims, but we just sat there, silent, the laundry forgotten, the TV screen flickering in the dark. I told her then, everything I remembered, the way my foot had hit something, the way it felt, that sick twist in my stomach. She told me she'd felt it too, the wrongness, the sense that something was there watching. She said she'd never been able to explain it, but that night had haunted her ever since. She said it was like something had touched her without touching her. We sat up most of that night, didn't say much, just held each other and listened to the wind push against the windows. I think about that night more than I probably should. Every so often, I'll remember the exact feeling of my foot touching that body, the way it gave just a little under the pressure, how I didn't have to see it to know something was deeply, terribly wrong. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had knelt down, or if I'd kicked it harder, if I'd shined a light. Sometimes I imagine his face, hiding in the trees, just a few feet away, watching us, waiting. I never went back to that trail, not once. We moved after a few years. Not because of that exactly, but maybe it was part of it. We needed new air, new trees. I still love the outdoors, still hike sometimes, but I always bring a flashlight now, and I always trust that feeling, that deep down warning that tells you something's not right. Because sometimes you don't need ghosts or monsters. Sometimes the real horror is just a few steps off the trail, watching you from the dark. We used to camp on Old Man Kamarek's land, a wide stretch of scrubby ranchland tucked between low hills and thick patches of mesquite. He was a gruff old guy, mostly kept to himself, but for some reason he let our Boy Scout troop use a part of his land a few times each year. I never really understood why. Maybe he liked the idea of kids learning how to rough it, or maybe he just didn't care what we did as long as we didn't light his fields on fire or mess with his cattle. This particular trip was in the early fall, when the days were still hot but the nights dipped low enough that your sleeping bag actually felt good. We were preparing for some upcoming jamboree, so the troop leaders had us drilling nonstop. Knot tying, shelter building, fire starting, compass courses, that kind of thing. But the main thing we focused on that weekend was lashing. We lashed together tables, chairs, flagpoles, and cooking tripods. That's what the whole weekend was about. Working together, building things, learning to keep them standing up straight. The land we camped on was about a half-mile off the dirt road, and we had to walk everything in: gear, water jugs, firewood, food. Mr. Komarek had an old rusted gate that he always left chained but unlocked for us. And from there we'd follow a faint 2-track trail until it faded out into a clearing that sloped toward a dry creek. We always camped at the same spot, just past a stand of cedar trees, under a low rise that gave a little wind cover. There were no real structures out there. No barns, sheds, or houses nearby. Just open range and the occasional cluster of cattle fences that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I remember the night we found the skull because it was one of the colder nights. The sky was clear and full of stars, and the wind had started to pick up as the sun went down. A few of us were poking around the far side of the rise, looking for dry wood or just messing around, and that's when someone kicked it. It wasn't buried or anything, just lying there half in the dirt, half in the brush. A cow's skull, yellowed and dry, with big, empty sockets and one horn broken clean off. We passed it around like it was treasure, inspecting the cracks, the teeth, the feel of it in our hands. It was light, almost brittle, and smelled faintly of old dirt and sun-baked grass. Somebody joked that we should keep it, that it was good luck or something, but we didn't really have a plan for it. It ended up tossed near the fire ring, left there while we went back to tying knots and building things. That weekend, we built a cooking tripod out of thick pine poles, lashed at the top with heavy rope. It stood maybe 6 feet high, with a steel hook hanging from the middle where you could hang a pot over a fire. It was solid, and we used it to boil water and cook soup for the 2 nights we were there. It was nothing fancy, but it worked. By Sunday, the camp was packed up, trash policed, ashes spread. We were tired and sunburned, dragging our feet as we hiked back to the cars. As we were leaving, just before the last few guys walked out of the clearing, one kid, Jimmy or Travis or maybe one of the newer ones, ran back and grabbed the cow skull. He walked over to the tripod and jammed it onto the top, wedging the broken horn into the lashing so it stuck upright. It looked ridiculous, like some kind of desert totem. We all laughed, shrugged, and walked away. No one thought twice about it. We left the tripod standing because we were coming back in a few weeks and didn't feel like tearing it down and rebuilding it again. The skull was just a joke, something dumb boys do when they think something looks cool or weird. A month later, I was eating cereal in the morning before school when my dad flipped open the local paper. It was a small-town weekly, full of classifieds, grain prices, and little human interest blurbs. But this time, there was a black and white photo right on the second page, clear as day. The tripod, the fire ring, and right at the top, the cow skull. The headline said something like, "Ritual site found on ranch land," or "Possible devil worship on Komarek property." I can't remember the exact words, but it stopped me cold. The article described how someone, a hunter maybe, or someone checking fences, had found what looked like a ceremonial setup. A burned-out fire ring, an old skull perched on a strange wooden structure, and scorch marks in the dirt. The tone was cautious, not sensational, but you could tell they didn't know what to make of it. They used words like bizarre, unnerving, and occult. They interviewed Old Man Komarek, who apparently had no idea we'd left anything behind. He said he hadn't been out there in weeks. My dad made some offhand joke about weirdos out in the woods and kept flipping through the paper. I just stared at the picture. It was surreal. Seeing something I'd helped build turned into a mystery for everyone else. I didn't say anything. I didn't tell my dad. I didn't tell my troop leader. And as far as I know, none of the other guys said anything either. In the weeks that followed, the story took on a life of its own. Kids at school started talking about the ritual site out on Komarek's land. Someone said there were symbols burned into the ground. Someone else claimed they'd heard animal screams out there at night. It wasn't long before it became a kind of urban legend, or I guess rural legend, the place where devil worshippers met, the place where cults gathered, the place you dared your friends to visit at night. I didn't buy into any of it. I knew the truth. I'd helped build the damn thing. I'd watched a dumb kid jam a skull on top and laugh like it was nothing. But I never said a word. None of us did. What really got weird was how long the story lasted. A year or two later, after I'd moved on from Scouts and started high school, the legend only got stronger. People whispered about it in the locker room. Girls told stories about it at sleepovers. Guys used it as a place to impress their girlfriends. Drive out there late at night, hike into the woods, and show them the satanic altar. I heard someone claimed they found bones out there. Another said they saw candles and a pentagram. I knew none of that was true. We'd never done any of that. But rumors have a way of feeding themselves. I went back once a few years later, just to see if it was still there. It was summer, late afternoon, and I had nothing better to do. I parked at the gate and walked in like we used to. The path was even fainter now, more overgrown. The clearing looked smaller than I remembered, the trees taller. But there it was. The tripod had fallen over, one of the legs rotted at the base. The skull was gone, probably taken by some high school kid, or maybe just cracked and crumbled with time. The fire ring was still there, half filled with blown-in dirt and leaves. It felt strange to stand there, knowing that something we built without thinking had sparked so much talk, so much fear, so many stories. No one ever knew it was just us. A bunch of kids messing around with rope and poles and a skull we found in the brush. It made me think about how easily stories form, how quickly a simple thing becomes something bigger and darker in people's minds. I never told anyone. I don't even think I mentioned it to the other guys in the troop. We all moved on, went to college or jobs or whatever came next. But I've thought about it a lot over the years. Not because I'm guilty, we didn't do anything wrong, but because of what it turned into. The story took on a shape of its own, far beyond what we intended. It made me realize how the world can twist what it sees, how something innocent can be seen as evil just because of how it looks. I sometimes wonder if Komarek ever figured it out, if he ever guessed it was us. He never brought it up again, never barred us from using the land, at least not while I was still in Scouts. Maybe he thought better of it. Or maybe he liked the idea that something spooky had happened on his property. Gave him a story to tell. The last I heard, the place was still talked about. Still considered haunted or cursed or whatever the latest version of the story was. It was a go-to-dare spot. One of those places kids go to test their courage. And all of it started because one dumb kid thought a skull on a tripod looked funny. I guess that's the real point. We didn't mean to start anything. We didn't carve symbols or chant or summon anything. We were just boys in the woods, building stuff, playing around, and doing what boys do. But the world saw something different, and that was enough. That was all it took. We created a legend without meaning to, something that stuck in the minds of the people who found it and twisted itself into something dark, something creepy, something no one ever really explained, and no one ever knew it was us. We'd been camping on that property in Utah since before I could remember. My grandfather bought it in the late 60s, a few dozen acres of forest and scrubland tucked away in a valley between the dry hills. It wasn't anything fancy. No cabin or running water, no power lines, just a big open meadow, a patch of trees, and some worn-out trails leading up into the hills. Every summer, usually the second week of July, our family would load up the trucks and head out. My cousins, uncles, aunts, everyone. We'd bring tents, coolers, folding chairs, and a stack of firewood tied down in the trailer. The place had a rhythm to it. We'd always set up camp in the same spots. My parents near the big juniper tree, my uncle under the ridge for the morning shade, and my cousins and I out in the open, where we could see the stars at night. We knew where to pitch our tents to avoid the cold breeze that rolled through just before dawn. We knew which rocks to avoid when we went barefoot. We knew the smell of the dry sage and the feel of the cracked earth under our feet. And we knew, without thinking about it too much, that there wasn't much out there besides jackrabbits, birds, and the occasional chipmunk that would steal food if we left anything out. That was the thing, we never worried about big animals. The property wasn't deep wilderness. It wasn't Yellowstone or Glacier. It was just remote enough to be peaceful, far enough from town to see the Milky Way. Over the years, the worst we ever dealt with was a rattlesnake sunning itself on the trail, and that only happened once. We never even saw deer, which was odd, looking back. We always chalked it up to the dryness or bad timing. But even then, it never crossed our minds to be on alert for anything more dangerous. We didn't carry bear spray, no guns. My uncle had a flare gun, but it was mostly a joke he pulled out when he'd had too many beers. My dad was always the first one up. Every morning, like clockwork, he'd unzip his tent around 6 a.m. and shuffle out into the chill air with his old metal coffee cup, the one with the dent in the side and the blackened bottom from 100 fires. He liked to sit on a folding stool next to the fire pit and sip his coffee while the sun came up over the ridge. It was his favorite part of the day, before the noise started, before the kids got loud and someone burned the bacon. That year was no different. Same spot, same stool, same coffee cup. I was still asleep when it happened. So were my mom, my cousins, all of us. But my dad was out there, like always, sitting in the cold air, watching the light spill across the meadow. He told us later that the morning had been dead quiet. No birds yet, no wind, just him, his coffee, and a bit of steam coming off the ground as the sun hit the dew. Then he heard something. First, it was just the sound of leaves moving, not like a breeze, but something pushing through them. Heavy steps, not twigs snapping, nothing sharp, just the slow grind of something big moving through the brush. He didn't get up. He just leaned forward a bit, squinting toward the tree line. It was maybe 30 yards away, thick with pine and underbrush. Then the sound stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a deer burst out from the trees. He said it was so fast he barely had time to process what he was seeing. The deer shot out from the brush, a young doe, not full grown. It was moving fast, head low, legs kicking up dirt. It bolted across the edge of the meadow, 15 yards from where my dad was sitting. Then, right behind it, something else came out of the trees. The mountain lion. He said it didn't make a sound. No roar, no growl, not even a rustle. 1 second it wasn't there, and the next it was. It was long and low to the ground, moving like liquid muscle, and it closed the gap between them in just a few bounds. The deer tried to veer left, but it was too late. The lion lunged, catching the deer mid-stride, and they both went down hard. My dad said the sound was unreal, like someone dropping a sack of wet cement onto the ground. The deer screamed once, then it didn't make another sound. He sat there frozen, coffee still in hand, body locked up. The lion didn't even look at him. It just stood there over the deer for a few seconds, jaws clamped around the neck. Then, just as fast, it dragged the carcass back into the woods, disappearing into the brush like it had never been there. When we woke up a little later, my dad was already on his second beer. He didn't say anything at first, just pointed toward the far edge of the meadow. The grass was all torn up. There were deep hoof marks in the dirt, scattered pine needles, and something darker, blood, leading off toward the trees. We followed it for a little while just to the edge. You could see where the struggle happened. There were claw marks in the dirt. More blood. Then it just vanished into the thick brush. None of us had ever seen anything like that. Not out there. Not on our land. We didn't even know mountain lions were still in the area. My uncle joked that maybe it had followed someone's dog up from town, but nobody laughed. The whole campsite felt different after that. Quieter. The kids weren't running off alone anymore. We kept the fires burning later than usual, even when it was warm out. And my dad? He didn't drink coffee for the rest of the trip. Every morning it was a beer, and he never sat out alone again. That day changed how we thought about that land. It had always felt like ours, like a family backyard stretched out under a bigger sky. We knew the rocks and the trees and the smell of the air when the sun hit the dry grass. But we didn't know what was watching us. We didn't know what moved when we slept. We stayed the rest of the week, but something had shifted. My cousins didn't want to play out of sight. My mom kept checking the cooler to make sure the lid was tight, like raw meat would bring it back. At night, we all listened. We didn't say we were scared, but we were. We listened for anything. Footsteps, breathing, that strange silence that falls over the land before something bad happens. We never saw it again. No more signs, no more blood, but the memory of it stayed. Even now, years later, when I go out there alone or with friends, I don't step into the brush without thinking about it. I move slower, I look around more, and I always keep something sharp or heavy within reach, just in case. That was the only time we ever saw something like that on the property. And it didn't take long for the grass to grow back, for the blood to disappear, for the signs to fade. But the way we saw that land, that never went back to normal. It never will. We thought we knew the place, but we were just visitors. It took one morning, one quiet moment, for the land to remind us that it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to everything that lives in it, everything that hunts in it. And some mornings, if you're up early enough, and if the wind is right, you can still hear something moving in the brush. But you won't see it, not until it's already seen you.